Welcome to One Week Critiques, the interview series, number 18. Today I have the pleasure of being with Alison Hawthorne Deming, whose most recent books include Zoologies on Animals and the Human Spirit and the poetry collection Stairway to Heaven, recipient of a Guggenheim Stegner Fellowship at Stanford University, National Endowments for the Arts Fellowships, and the Walt Whitman Award for her 1993 book, Science and Other Poems. She lives in Tucson and Grand Manan, New Brunswick, Canada. Her new nonfiction book, A Woven World, will be out from Counterpoint Press in August 2021. She also, I'm going to mention this on the top, Alison once ran the Poetry Center in Tucson, which is having its 60th anniversary, and I'm told by our mutual friend John Riccio, who collected many of the recordings from the Poetry Center, that you ran one of the finest eras in those 60 years. Welcome, Alison.
Thank you so much. It's great to be with you.
So Alison, would you tell me and our audience a little bit about yourself, anything I might have missed worth mentioning?
That's a good nutshell, Adam, to start with. I mean, I grew up in New England. I'm a 10th generation New Englander, but I've been in Tucson now for 31 years. So, and of course, I still go up to Atlantic Canada. So I'm a kind of bifurcated person, geographically speaking. And, you know, I've been writing since I was a kid. My parents both wrote, and it was just something people in my family did. And I did it in the closet for many, many decades. I was, you know, late to publish my first book, but I started publishing in my 40s, and then it was just like gangbusters, you know, and just grateful to have a life in writing, really.
Yeah, you've, not only because I think a lot of people of the moment, because of the proliferation of MFAs and other forms that feel a little more pushed to do that, but also because I think it's going to situate us a little bit in the context of what your newest book is doing. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself and your background and how it leads into this semi-autobiographical, semi-genealogical, semi-research narrative that you got going on in the woven world?
Yeah. So I grew up, you know, with a family, mother, father, brother, and me, and a grandmother. My mother's mother lived with us throughout our childhood. And, you know, when you're a child, your grandmother is just an old woman, and she's interesting, and mine was particularly sparkly and smart and entertaining and stylish. But she was just the old lady who lived in the house, and I didn't ever fully know her, I think, which maybe we can all say about our grandmothers when we're little. She lived into her 90s, but she had run a dressmaking business in New York City from the late 1800s until the end of the Depression. And it was a business that she took over from her mother, who had been a dressmaker in Paris and had made dresses for the Empress Eugénie, the wife of Napoleon III. And then that great grandmother came to New York, brought a business, started a business in New York, which my grandmother took over. So, you know, you have these moments when you realize you've missed some really important stuff in your own life, like these amazing women who were accomplished, were artistic, were worldly, kind of cosmopolitan women, ran a business, you know, from counting the two generations from the 1870s until the Depression, and I knew nothing about them. And because they were women-run businesses, there was hardly anything documented about them. So, you know, I started just becoming really aware of a huge sense of loss about my matrilineal line, you know, from my mother to my grandmother to my great-grandmother, remarkable women. I knew nothing about them, and there were no stories about them. So I decided to try to research that. And the goofy thing I did with this project is that I was walking with a writer friend, Barbara Hurd, up in Canada, my place, and we were walking among the old abandoned fish houses up there where they used to make smoked herring. And it was a really big part of the island industry for a couple hundred years. And I was telling her all about, oh, how they catch a fish and all the history. And she said, wow, you know a lot about this. You should write a book about that. I said, yeah, but I want to write about these women and, you know, they were dressed. She said, oh, it's the same book. And I looked at her, you know, in that writerly way where you say, yeah, right. And you take a preposterous idea and you say, okay, I'm going to write a book about dressmakers and fishermen and my life among them. And, you know, so it's a strange woven book in which I'm looking at these cultures that were just sort of beautiful and perfectly matched to their time and place and the way people made their livings. And, you know, it's something that's getting wrung out of the world by the whole corporate capitalistic advance. And I didn't want to let it go. So that's what this book, A Woven World, is trying to do, is say, okay, let's weave some of this old way of being together and you know, hold it up.
Very good.
I can't remember what the question was you asked me. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, it did. I was leading in to ask a little bit about what the book is about. And one of the reasons I'm interested in doing that now is often, or always in these interviews, we have the author read a little bit of an earlier version of their work, and then later on, that later version, as always, folks can find on our website those two versions for comparison and study if they want to look at them a little more closely and take ideas from those types of editing. You sent me, interestingly, you're the first person to send me sort of journal notes, and I mentioned to you in my email that, you know, my own way of making notes, I can't imagine anyone reading and finding any coherence in. You've got, not only because you're weaving a lot of different kinds of information, like the history of fishnets or a little bit about Napoleon and his sex life and so forth. But you're also attending to your own life and the things that are happening while you're researching within the book. And in the section that folks can find on the website, they'll see that you're moving through Paris at a particular time. I'm actually going to pull up, if you don't mind, a section where you're on a train and you meet a young woman who you have a conversation with. And we're going to take a look at that one because it translates pretty directly.
Okay. On return, intercities train, hoping I am on the train to Paris, as woman asks me in French if we are headed to Paris. I tell her yes. I'd already noticed her, small, lean, attractive, black, narrow mohawk on shaved head, silver earrings, black leather, femme stylized biker jacket, jeans all pocked with fashion tears, as if plaid. We joke, we will be lost together. Let me ask someone in my bad French, her accent very thick, hard to hear, English, French. Maybe she's slurring a bit. Later she asks, can she sit with me? Yes, she joins. Mother died of AIDS, half-sister, went to Kenya, family didn't want to know her. Grew up in London, Kenya. Here to go back to Somalia. You've had a hard life. I'm sorry. You don't need to be sorry. Later, because of what we talked about, this is her talking again, I'm a stripper. Don't judge me. I'm sorry, she says. You don't need to be sorry. We embrace. Gone.
Cool. Thank you for reading a little bit of that for us. So I have a lot of notes, or a lot of questions about your notes. First of all, they're a little bit journal entry. They have a flavor of the way that you write poetry and the way that you interact with language, even there. I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit about just how you start to develop your notes, if you are journaling, if you carry a notebook around, some of the basic, how do you do what you do stuff?
Yeah, I carry often when I'm traveling like that, and this was a research trip that my daughter and I took to Paris to try to find some information or echoes of this great grandmother. I carry a notebook. This is my standard journal with blank pages. I really like blank pages. I buy these in packets of 20. I've used the same notebook for like, made on recycled paper in Canada. I've used that same notebook. And so I had gone to one of the estates of Napoleon and Eugenie that day at Compiègne, and I had filled that notebook with stuff about the history and the period when my great-grandmother would have been there making dresses. And so it was on the train. And so while, you know, you'll see in some of the journal entries, they're really long and paragraphy. And that's when I have plenty of time to sit down and fill this, right? But then there are passages that are really notational, like this one about the woman I met on the train. And that may have been put in a little moleskin, you know, a little pocket-sized moleskin, because I didn't want to, I don't like to take notes when I'm talking to somebody because I think it violates something in the social contract, unless it's a formal interview and I say, you know, I'm going to take notes, but I rarely do that. And so certainly with this, I didn't want to take notes. So the second we parted, I pulled out my little pocket notebook and just, you know, you can feel the haste in those notes. It's just like, this isn't what I'm here to research at all. But there was something in the encounter that told me, you know, this is the moment in which you and your daughter are living and traveling in Paris. You are not traveling in the 19th century, and you better pay attention, you know, to what life is now here and who is here now. And of course, all the issues of race and class and color, it's so totally different, you know, from the mid-19th century to now. So I knew it was important and I wrote it down, and I didn't know why. And I didn't know if it would go in the book or if it wouldn't go in the book. But, you know, when you do research and you're looking for somebody who is long dead, you might find information, you know, a date or an old business card or an advertisement or something, but it's not really very satisfying. Information is not very satisfying. What's experience is satisfying. And, you know, meeting that woman, it was emotionally satisfying. It was wrenching, it was touching, it was sad, it was sweet, it was all those things of being human. And it also is, was the first indication that I needed to pay attention to some of the larger cultural issues that were at play in Paris. And as it turned out, this was November of 2015, and we were there. The terrorist attacks came, I think, the very next day.
Yeah.
And so, you know, she somehow, even though, you know, she has like so few lines in the notebook, she became very important to me and emblematic of what I wanted to be sure I didn't exclude from how I was seeing this experience.
Yeah. So you have in this book a lot of things going on. And I have several more questions about how you formulate some of that past tense research. But while we're here, I'm wondering, I was a student of yours at the time this was going on, and I remember you coming back and this being this strange thing that you'd been amidst these terrorist attacks, and of course, on top of a book about sardine dresses and fishermen and everything else, that profound sense of the present moment and its conflicts lands on you. I'm wondering about how that makes its way into the book for you and how you address the present tense at all, which you do situate yourself in very clearly in this book, and there is a very deep interweaving kind of mantra of we look for her, we look for her.
Right.
Intense.
So one of the conclusions I came to in this book, and there's so many times when I looked for her, I looked for these women and I couldn't find them, you know, like her immigration records burned up in a fire. You know, everything was inaccessible to me. And I began to feel that, okay, it doesn't mean that I can't write this. What it means is that it isn't the story of an individual. It's a story of the culture in which she lived and the culture in which we live now. So it's kind of, you know, the memoiristic aspect. I've always wanted memoir to be more like a sort of cultural memoir, like we are cultural products and we are cultural makers. We're not individuals, and all the hyper-individualism of American life is very troubling to me. And so because I couldn't find very many facts, I ended up feeling, well, that's fine. And it became increasingly important to write about the present moment. So the book moves from a lot of history about both of these things, the herring fishery and sardines and all that, and these women and fashion and how fashion has moved over this period of time. You know, the woman on the train also is a fashion statement. I mean, that's the other thing. You know, I'm writing about all these ridiculously elaborate dresses. You know, Empress Eugenie has, I think, something like 250 dresses made for the ceremony at the opening of the Suez Canal. It's like, it's so opulent and obscene. It's beyond obscene. It's like, I mean, why? You know, nobody could wear that many dresses, but whatever. And then, you know, here's this woman with these fashion jeans who makes her life by wearing nothing, you know, makes a living by wearing nothing as a stripper. And so she is a fashion statement, and she is using the female body as an instrument to survive very, very difficult circumstances. So she, you know, she fit right into the whole, what are women's bodies and what work do we do with what we put on them? And you know, she became really important. There are more, you know, the Paris chapters. There's a there's a whole weird sort of fragmented chapter that's just quotations. Hello, George Saunders. It's just splicing together of quotations from 5 different historical source books, which is sort of an admission of, okay, I'm giving up on the story. I'm giving up on the facts. Here's a sort of way of trying to see what the culture was like at that time. And then there's a chapter called The Lace Maker. My daughter and I go to the Louvre when it finally opens on the 3rd day after the attacks, because everything was shut down, and we're terrified, you know, to do anything. You know, we're just terrified because nobody knows. Will there be anthrax? Will there be more gun? You know, and there's cops and military guys with gigantic guns everywhere you go, but finally they opened the Louvre. And we said, we are going to go. And we went terrified, stood in line with all the other terrified people. Yeah. But we were determined to take the lead from the Parisians, whose attitude was, I go to the bars and I have a drink and I'm not afraid. And I mean, they were so different in their response from them. We were afraid, but the posture is, I'm not afraid. I'm going to the Louvre. Terrified, of course. You know, is that guy ahead of me, does he have a strap-on bomb on his chest? You know, who knows? But that chapter is about getting into the Louvre and seeing this beautiful painting of Vermeer's called The Lace Maker. And so it's like, you know, that chapter starts in present time and goes back into deep time to look at this maker, this woman who's just sitting there with this very intricate system of making what's called bobbin lace by threading these colored threads around these pins on a little cushion in her lap. And it's just this serene image of a woman as a maker. And so, you know, I don't know. I'm trying to hold together the beauty and peace of the creative act, and how it's a foundational act. A creative act in any context is a foundational act of civilization, you know. And then how always in my great-grandmother's time, in my mother's time, and in our time, violence is on the periphery of our lives. And there it is. And, you know, my answer, and I see violence as an unmaking, and we see all kinds of violences, all kinds of unmakings going on in the world and in our society, in the US of Dear A. And, you know, to hold up all the ways that making is, you know, that's what we have to do, folks, you know. It's not screaming and crying is okay, and sometimes we have to do it, but it doesn't stop there. You have to be making, you know, the culture that will sustain you and those you care about into the future. So anyway, long, circuitous, wacky answer, but there you have it.
No, I greatly appreciate that. When you're making hair, that's my least transition. So you're doing a lot of research, as you've mentioned, to do some of that creation. For you, I don't know that it's entirely a new form of research to do quite so much historical record searching, and I'm going through, I think, obviously from a lot of your books, you're doing reading, you're citing your sources, you're thinking things out on the page as well as in the real world. But I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about some of that library work and how that differs from note-taking and journaling, and how and why you've approached the sources you've approached here and elsewhere.
Yeah, well, because there was so little known about Louisa, the great-grandmother, I wanted, I mean, even just to find a birth record would be great, because I couldn't find a birth certificate for her. It's like she didn't exist. So I hired a research assistant, because I don't have very much French at all. And I hired a French speaker to accompany me to some magnificent old archives in Paris. And you know, she was calling around trying to find a birth certificate for her, and we probably never found one. We found one that might have been it, but I don't think it was. And we were also looking, so I said, okay, you know, let's go into these archives, and if we can't find things like that, let's look at what was happening in fashion at that time. Let's look at, you know, where she would have been looking at fabric samples. And so, you know, we get these huge boxes of materials from 1860 where, you know, there would be these sample books of threads and little squares of fabric that you could feel, so that you knew what to order from the weavers in Lyon or wherever you were getting your fabrics. And so I wanted to have a feel for the life, you know. I actually, in the end, it was like, screw the facts, you know, I want to feel for this life in any modest way that I can get it. So, you know, I didn't really find that much other than some of those tactile experiences were very profound, and they end up, like the last chapter of the book, I actually go to Lyon to look at the weaving, the type of silk weaving that was being done in her life, because there's a beautiful Musée de Tissu in Lyon that shows the whole history of the silk weaving there. But, you know, there's a moment in this chapter where this young guy's in the same research library where I am, and he says to me, he's French, but he you know, he hears my research assistant and I trying to talk, and he says, so you're interested in dresses? And you know, he's a young guy, probably in his 30s, and then he tells me how in the villages, you know, everybody has a dressmaker, even in his childhood, and a hat maker, and that, you know, in some respects was better than finding some name somewhere. So, you know, I am a poor researcher. I am not a journalist. I don't have patience to go through a lot of grids of data and names and numbers. I'm very bad at it. I don't like it because I like images. I'm a poet first, you know. I love image, I love experiential learning. I love following a train of thought that doesn't seem fruitful, but that might be. But I needed to have some sense that Louisa de Saint-Hilary actually existed. And so of course I did research in New York too, and at the New York Public Library, again, couldn't find birth certificate, couldn't find immigration. So I had the good fortune to connect through a reference librarian there with a branch of the New York Public Library, which I think is the Library of Science and Technology. And I emailed the guy what I was looking for. I said, I just want to find this woman's name. Did she actually run a dressmaking business or didn't she? Any time between 1865 and 1920, look for this name. And I made an appointment to go visit him in New York, and I got there, and he, he's just this quiet library research guy who can do the things I don't have the patience to do. He said, I think I found your great grandmother. And he pulled up a citation to her name at a given address. And it was an address that I knew was one of the addresses where she had lived, and the business was in their home. And he told me where to go to another library to go through all the microfiche, where I could see year by year all the businesses in New York. And then that's where I found, Louisa Blaney, dressmaker, listed every single year from, I forget what it is, but I think it's in the chapter, 1876 to 1909, after which the daughters would have taken it over, and the name must have changed because I couldn't find the name anymore. But that was, you would think, oh, whoop, big deal. But I was leaping out of my skin in joy because it was like, yes, she existed. Yes, she really had a real business. And then I was able to find some advertisements, where she was looking to hire somebody to do finish work or whatnot. And so, there's a certain amount of reality you need to feel like you're just not making something up. Because my mother, she didn't like her mother. She wouldn't tell any stories. She was like, a family story is a river running through your life. My mother was like a huge dam in the river. So I didn't have a family story, even though this woman lived with us.
Yeah.
So, but I am really deficient as a researcher, and I'm terrified that somebody will read this book and say, well, here are the 5 sources you can, here's everything you couldn't find. What kind of a researcher are you? I mean, I'm sure. Probably it wouldn't have been that hard, but, I'm looking for something else, story, association, image, the sort of weight that objects begin to have, a simple object, a simple bit of fabric or something, and, I guess that's the poet sensibility that comes into, nonfiction form.
Sure. I'm actually really interested in that in several ways. One, in that some of what you're talking about, or some of what you were talking about a little bit earlier, was about the kind of contrast between individual identity and a need to be individualized. And also, of course, right, the book and here, when you tell a social history, you start to acquire representative characters, some of which, in order for your own historical coherence, needs to be seen through genealogy or just, lesser known figures. One moment that is tremendously funny to me in the chapter that you sent along, it describes an encounter, we'll say, with Napoleon and a woman. And so the simple version of this question is, can we talk about why it's easier to track down stories about the pansy-ass Napoleon's erection than it is to find your grandmother, and what is what's some of the relevance of that for you?
Well, it's so ironic. You know, this was at Compiègne when Napoleon II was trying to court Eugenie. She wasn't yet his wife, and he was just known as a philanderer. I mean, he had this whole, even later after they were married, he had this whole system in the royal palace of women being presented to him as possible, you know, bedmates, and there was code, you know, he was, I must retire with my papers, and that was meant, you know, I can't remember whether that meant yes or no, but those women would be shuttled into his bedchamber and told that they could kiss any part of his person except his face, and you know, but so he was a terrible philanderer, and so that's in any history you read about this man, they're always talking about, you know, how he was screwing around, and so, you know, the part about the erection, I kind of made up because they don't actually say that, but I loved thinking about this guy. Because Eugenie, before they were married, wouldn't sleep with him, as they used to say. And I just imagined this desperate, horny guy who was used to getting anything and everything he ever wanted with, you know, there's just irrepressible problem in his pants. And I thought, hey, that's a fashion statement too. And imagined his pants being ripped while he's out on his horse because of it, etc. So yes, well, there you go. You know, what do you do if you try to imagine a man with that history, and how might an event like that interact with the seamstresses who would be out at this country palace? Well, if he rips his trousers, you know, the dressmakers are going to have something to talk about. And, you know, if you ever heard women on a factory line or women working on a fishing community, the talk gets pretty bawdy, shall we say. If not randy. And so I just thought, well, I could have some fun with this. So sure, his sexual history is documented because he's famous and powerful and a ruler, if inept and horrible. Whereas Louisa was just a dressmaker. She was, you know, this is an artisan class. These are the makers. You think about, you know, so Napoleon II was the one who, you know, initiated the occupation of Mexico by the French to try to turn it into a French colony. Didn't work for very long, but you try to imagine. I sort of lost my train of thought, but. You know, the thing is that he had that kind of power that history cares about his life. But okay, so the French occupation of Mexico, we know how many soldiers went at various dates and where those soldiers were recruited. They, you know, were recruited from. But nobody writes about, there must have been dressmakers who went. There must have been shoemakers who went. There must have been horseshoers who went. There must have been, you know, this whole class of makers that support the aristocracy in the handmade period of history. And no one will write the history book about those people. And yet there they were, laboring and making and probably taking pride in their craft, even though they saw how utterly corrupt and, you know, reprehensible those in power were behaving. And it's a class, I guess it's, you know, it's the beginning of the middle class maybe, but it's something else, because these are people who do work that take a lot of skill. I think there's real dignity in that kind of work. And who's telling their stories, you know? So poor Louisa, nobody's telling her story, and I can't even find it. But I can have a little fun imagining what women like Louisa might have said, you know, in the presence of this jerk with his ripped pants.
Well, on that note, let's give our viewers a little bit of consummation. You actually do come back to, you do address the young Somali woman that you meet in the book. You ended up incorporating her into it, and I'm super fascinated by how you end up doing that and the kinds of thought that you allow yourself finally. And I'm wondering if you can, before you read that section for us, speak a little bit to not only why you've chosen to keep this particular moment, but when you're writing your notes, they are very object oriented, right, and descriptive. You allow yourself a more global train of thought, and a more empathetic train of thought. You let yourself imagine her life a little bit. I'm wondering if you can speak to that choice and to opening up there.
Sure. You know, because it was an encounter in which there was real feeling and real affection, you know, and it was so unlikely. I had to keep thinking about, you know, well, it doesn't belong, but I had to keep thinking, because it's captured my curiosity. There's probably something there that I need to understand, and it really was, as that passage says, you know, okay, you're trying to find the past, and it's important. That task matters, and that's the larger task of the book. But you know, you have almost a moral obligation to open yourself to what is happening right before your eyes, and it sort of ends up being a foreshadowing of the attacks, of course. And you'll see that I also thought, well, you know, she had this history at Kenya and London and Somalia, and here she was in Paris on a train going to a job as a stripper. And I thought, I don't really know what the situation in Somalia is, but I know it's bad.
Yeah.
And particularly for women. I thought I need to understand that in order to understand her. And so you see when we get to the passage that you'll see how the research then came in. It's like, okay, you got to learn something about Somalia, even if this is, you know, very superficial. But it's a slice of, it's just kind of moving a little more deeply into understanding what the stakes were for this woman and how the choices she was making were so very, very hard, and how I could never pass judgment on her for the work she was doing, although she was apologizing to me about it. It was like, are you kidding, woman? If you are alive and able to take care of yourself, you know. Yeah. So you know, sometimes something shows up in your experience and your notes that you really don't think belongs, and those are the things I really welcome, because they're going to wake me up to something that I you know, that there's some deeper level of us that understands what's important in our inner life, in our emotional being, and the more rational part of us doesn't know why. But I always, if I get that feeling, you know, this matters. Why does it matter? Well, dig it in and see. And so, you know, that passage, which is, you know, a few lines, grows into, I think, about a page and a half. And it's also about the management of time in a piece of prose. I think that may be important to say when you're thinking about process. The management of time is really important. So if you have an experience that you want to recount that has a lot of emotional weight for you, you don't want to tell it in 4 lines. You want to hold it, you want to open it, you want time to open and expand so that your reader is spending more time in that experience by your side, and they have more of a chance to enter into the emotional space if possible. So I think about that a lot. When does time need to open? And when does time need to be compressed? And lots of time with the history, the time needs to be compressed. That little made-up scene with the seamstresses and the emperor's erection, that is a little scene where I opened time in an imagined scene. But a lot of that chapter has to have, you know, compressed time, because otherwise it's just incredibly boring. Sure. So I think that's an important thing to think about, is how you manage the flow of time. And where you want people to stay with you and where you want people to just, oh, let's get through this and get to the next thing. Because, you know, you just need to know a few things to understand where I'm headed, but you don't have to dwell there.
Sure. So I don't think this is a boring scene. I think everyone else will agree. Would you mind reading it for us?
I would not mind at all.
Cool. So anytime you're ready.
On the return train to Paris, a small, lean woman with a narrow mohawk on a shaved head asked me in French, "Is this the train to Paris?" I'd already noticed her, attractive, black, silver earrings. Were they skulls or razor blades? Black leather, femme-styled biker jacket, and jeans all pocked with fashion tears. Yes, I think so. We joked. Then we will be lost together. Let me ask someone in my bad French. Her accent was very thick in English, somewhat French, maybe North African. Can I sit with you? I was worried she wanted to hit on me for money, but I said yes. Slowly, our stories unfolded. She had grown up in London. Her mother died there of AIDS. She went back to Kenya to see her father for the funeral. She has a half-sister there. They didn't want to know her. She said she was trying to get back to Somalia. Somalia, where 40 years of drought and a collapsed government had led to war, poverty, disease, and starvation, where AIDS burns like a wildfire, young women and girls hit hardest through transactional or sugar daddy or violent sex, where people living with AIDS suffer such stigma that their families want nothing to do with them, where al-Shabaab terrorists siphon off the food and drugs targeted for humanitarian aid, where to become a displaced person may be the only way to survive. How hard must a person's life be in order for her to long for a return to this homeland? I told my traveling companion some stories from my life, but they didn't sound very hard anymore. You've had a hard life, I said. I'm sorry. You don't need to be sorry, she said. We rode quietly while the train passed through wooded hills, then a spindly plantation of trees, then a vast field of something that looked like cabbages. We were hurtling out of the past toward the Paris, not of the Tuileries and Montmartre, but of the banlieues and the cités, those brutalist projects where immigrants from Algiers, Tunisia, Mali, Syria, many of them Arabs, were stacked 20 stories high. They mixed with earlier immigrants from Poland and Italy and Portugal, Christian, Muslim, and Jew thrown together by their disadvantage, without a vocabulary for bridging distance in a secular nation and lacking a community to embrace them. These neighborhoods on the Paris outskirts are beds of poverty and social isolation. Crime, drug use, and violence are high in alienated communities where a sense of belonging is absent. I might have come to Paris in search of the past, but I found in the present moment lament beyond my imagining. Because of what we've talked about, my companion said, I want to tell you. Yes? She paused as if embarrassed to continue. To what extent could she entrust me with her story? I am a stripper. But she said stripper in that British way that sounds so beautiful. Don't judge me. I'm sorry. You don't need to be sorry. I thought then of the woman's vulnerability and power, all clothed in the economy of her body, and how she had used it to survive. Her body, unclothed, signified her survival. Then we arrived at the Gare du Nord. We embraced. Gone.
I love that that moment ends the way that it does, and that it fades away from the journal.
Such a strange thing, you know, but the world is filled with small moments of unexpected magic.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for reading that. And thank you for joining me today. As always, Folks can find us at oneweekcritique.com, which is the number oneweekcritique.com, where they can find your two pieces side by side along with those of our other interviewees. But Alison, if people want to find you, if they want you to read beautifully from a woven world, or any of your, got my Alison Deming stack here, any of your books, where can they reach out and ask for that? Where can they find you in the world?
Well, my website is very obvious, www.alisonhawthornedeming.com, or you can find me at the University of Arizona, ademing@arizona.edu. And I look forward to conversations with others and to sharing this book, which will be out in August from Counterpoint. So I'll be extremely excited to talk with people about it when it's out.
Cool, and hopefully in a slightly less COVID world.
Really? Well, if it's Zoom, it's Zoom, but I'm hoping we can actually see people once again in the flesh.
Cool. Well, thank you so much for joining us, Alison.
Thank you, Adam. Such a pleasure.